Senator, thank you so much for taking time to speak today. This is such an important topic. We had our first part of this episode, which is just on the maternal mortality crisis, go live just about an hour ago, actually, just went live. So this is part two, where we're taking a look at how the maternal health crisis affects incarcerated pregnant people. And I saw your bill, and I saw that it passed in April 2022. Is that when it was?
Yes, that's correct. So the
Um,
effective date was July 1, 2023.
Perfect. Okay.
Mhm.
So, but I just wanted to start off asking you, when did you become aware of not just shackling of pregnant incarcerated people, but just the health issues that pregnant incarcerated people face in general?
So it was a couple of years before we passed this legislation. You really started to hear more and more about maternal health, particularly the disproportionate impact on Black women. Also looking at these outcomes where you've had some local jails in Tennessee where folks are losing their children and or losing their child in childbirth, and so suing and having to deal with those consequences. That mother's life will never be the same. So found out about it probably about 2018. Really tried to work with some local groups across the state to figure out a solution. I think you know they have some of these packages that are a bit more inclusive, but we thought let's at least single out the shackling of incarcerated women that are pregnant and see what we can do with that.
I always tell folks that when I hear about shackling, the images that it evokes for me are incredibly painful, linking to like chain gangs and slavery. But I'm curious for you, when you learned about the shackling of particularly pregnant people, what was that moment like for you? Do you remember when you learned about that?
So I'd have to agree with you. I think anytime you hear shackling, you think about, the unfortunate history of slavery in our country, and it does kind of draw those images to mind. But for me, it's just childbirth is already a difficult experience for women. It's something that is extremely risky for the mother and also for the child. And so to think about a woman who needs to be able to move around, needs to be able to be in positions that are best for herself and the child and being restrained. I mean, it's such an inhumane image. And I think even for the mother, I mean, she's, giving birth, that's something that will forever change her life, bond her to an individual who will, could grow up to be president, could grow up to solve, you know, could grow up to create a solution for cancer. I mean, and then during this moment, this to be love and joy and everything else, they are being dehumanized in such a horrific way. And so I thought, there's no way that we can continue to allow this to exist. They're already incarcerated giving birth, and to have to be shackled or chained to a bed and their movements restricted is just not only unacceptable, in a health care perspective, but also just in a basic human being perspective.
When you first introduced the legislation, I'm curious, were your colleagues aware that shackling was happening and the dangers of it, both to the mother and to her child?
Tennessee is an extremely strong pro-life state. And for me, I tell folks, look, if you're pro-life, that's from the womb to the tomb. And I think a lot of people were surprised that women were being shackled during childbirth when they were incarcerated, especially some of my colleagues in the Senate that, they were just like, this should be a non-brainer, right? We ran into some problems in the House. We had some committee chairs, committee members that said, well, you know what? They could be a danger to the doctor or the nurse. And if they wanted a different experience, perhaps they shouldn't have committed a crime. It was completely ignoring the fact that we are all people, right? So no, my colleagues were surprised. They were surprised. Some of them felt surprised. Let's take this action to make sure that this does not happen to another pregnant incarcerated woman. And then some, which is why it took a couple of years to pass the legislation, just dug in further, like, well, good. And let's, make sure that our nurses and doctors are safe. One, I think chairwoman in particular, her daughter was a nurse, and she's like, well, I want my daughter to be safe if she's assisting in childbirth for someone who's incarcerated.
It's interesting, because I think there's probably many in our broader society who are not incarcerated who might see it that way. But as you mentioned, this is a very dehumanizing moment, and it also poses quite a few medical challenges as well, for the baby, for the mother, for the doctor to even be able to maneuver the mother how she would need to be in order to have that birth. And so I think of, I like your phrasing, pro-life from the womb to the tomb. How we know that when we look at maternal mortality, it is disproportionately affecting Black mothers as well as Black babies, and Native American mothers even more so. And we know the same thing with incarceration, disproportionately affecting the same demographics. So how does this then translate into a racial justice issue, and not even just a health justice issue?
Yeah, I think you can't separate the two. Just like you can't separate the fact that I was taking a course in college, and this fellow student asked me. He said, "Well, do you think it's more difficult being black or more difficult being a woman?" And I said, "I can't separate the two. They are intertwined into who I am." And so I feel the same way about this issue. This is definitely a racial justice issue, as well as a healthcare issue, because we're seeing a specific population that is being disproportionately impacted, and it cannot draw any other conclusion except for being Black or being Latina or being Native American. So I'm happy though that we kind of were able to portray it to our colleagues as, yes, this is universal, right? Motherhood does not discriminate, right? But at the same time, people who are entering motherhood can be discriminated against. And that's why legislation like this and other legislation that tries to preserve life in these situations is important, because we know most of the Black women who end up dying in childbirth or right after childbirth could have been preventable. In Tennessee, we commissioned a study several years ago, found that 95% of the women who died in childbirth or thereafter was avoidable, and there were steps that could be taken to avoid that consequence. And I think that's the same thing with this type of legislation. We were seeing anecdotally, and there are national statistics, but anecdotally in our state, where you had women who were being shackled and who were not, being properly treated while they were pregnant, and it was resulting in maybe not the loss of their life, but the loss of the child.
And I just think of how heartbreaking that must be for the mother, to go through the traumatic experience of being shackled or even being incarcerated, whether, again, that's, the way our society works, but then to lose your baby, perhaps because of the shackling or the lack of care. And I know that that's another element that many advocates, who are calling for an end to shackling nationwide, are also calling just for better healthcare in general, for incarcerated pregnant people. And I'm curious, what other maybe steps are you looking at for Tennessee to be able to take to ensure that, the life of the mother as well as the child are preserved and being taken care of during that time of incarceration?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. We did pass legislation as well that ensured health care during the pregnancy, before the pregnancy, and after the pregnancy. Um, I'll tell you, one of my colleagues, London Lamar, she's a state senator as well. She passed legislation last year that creates a study about the use of doulas, not necessarily within the prison population, but in general, having insurance cover it. The governor allocated about $1 million for that study. And so just kind of continue to see what that looks like. Because again, if we're saying that we're investing and we want to make sure that our families are the strongholds of our state and children have a right to be born healthy and free, then that encompasses them being able to be actually born and healthy. So we're working on it. It's an interesting state we find ourselves in because, also we're in this post-Dobbs world. And so we're kind of leaning a little heavily on my colleagues saying, look, well, you want women to have children that they may not necessarily be ready for. What sort of supports are you going to provide for that child? What sort of supports are you going to provide to make sure that that mother is able to have a healthy childbirthing experience? So it's an interesting place that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and I did want to ask about that too. Being post Dobbs, we understand, or we have had many conversations both before and after the Dobbs decision about the impact that this will have, particularly on women of color, and potentially the deeper criminalization that these same women will face. And there was even questions about, if you miscarry, does that mean that you've somehow aborted your baby, all of these questions, so many of them.
Yeah.
And as we're looking now at women who are incarcerated, I had several women who had an advocates who had said that this is a deeper concern about how this is now going to affect not just our incarceration rates, but the maternal mortality crisis in general. How is that affecting the way that you're looking at the healthcare that we have available for our women right now? Are you concerned that we'll see higher rates incarcerated? Are you concerned about what's going to happen now without the ability for women to, if for some reason have to have their child aborted, or if they miscarry in prison, what the effects could be for them?
Well, I think there this is a scary time, right? I think it's a scary time to be a woman who's pregnant or contemplating pregnancy. One, if you have a health risk, Tennessee does not have a real exception for women who have a health risk, where it might be for the health of the mother and the child, for that child to be aborted, or the health of the mother. Also, we have the lines are very gray, right? You saw there was a national case where they are looking to incarcerate a woman who, had a miscarriage and, everything that happened thereafter. But yes, I think that it could have an impact on that. One, we already know that it's more difficult for communities of color to be able to access these facilities. Now that they've been completely shut down in our states, having to go to Illinois or even further to get this done. One, you're talking about taking off work. You're talking about actually paying the transportation to get there and to get back, and just totally disrupting your regular life. Again, I've tried to pass legislation last year that basically clarified that morning after pills and birth control were not considered forms of abortion. That bill died in committee. They allowed us to pass a resolution though, which really said the same thing. So it's such a political issue when it should be a healthcare issue. I think that the Republican Party has, for decades made this one of their, things that they stand on and run on, not even really caring about the actual impacts that will have on a woman's daily life. And we're not just talking about Black women, women of color, women in urban areas. We're talking about women in rural areas where they don't have access to health care. Because Tennessee is a state that has not expanded Medicaid, they, have to go 45 minutes or further to seek care. You're talking about a state like Tennessee where it's such a unhealthy climate for an OB-GYN. They really are questioning why they should stay here. So then you lose that level of expert care. When we have fantastic institutions like Vanderbilt right in Nashville. So it's a very difficult time all around. And I do think that there's a possibility and a fear that it could lead to increased criminal charges and increased prison population. And then you'll still deal with the consequences of a mother who is incarcerated or a pregnant woman who is incarcerated. So it's not good. And at the end of the day, it doesn't talk about people. It more so indicates the politics of a state.
We are seeing what appears to be an increased sort of attention on the maternal mortality crisis and maternal health in general, I think. And I think about those who are at the federal level, from folks like Lauren Underwood and Alma Adams and Robin Kelly, to even Vice President Kamala Harris, who was an ardent supporter of maternal health care during her time in the Senate. How important is it for us to have state and federal leaders on sort of the same page to say we need to do something about this crisis that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important to have folks on a federal level that are pushing this and to have strong voices like Lauren Underwood, who is a nurse, and the vice president, who is just respected and revered across this world, because the federal government drives overarching policy of what we do in our states. Now, some of us, unfortunately, are in deep red states, so it does make it more difficult. But when you attach federal funding to these initiatives, so it does make it kind of there's a financial incentive. People think that fiscally they can do it. I think it does help. I mean, you see a state like Texas where you had State Representative Tony Rose, who is a Democrat, pushed through important legislation to make sure that women are getting postpartum care for 12 months. You see that's something that Tennessee, it initially was a pilot. Last year, we made it a actual fully functioning program. So I do think the federal government allowing these types of opportunities and states taking advantage of it makes a tremendous impact. And even more so, I'll say, as a Black woman, it is important to see these Black women saying, hey, you know what? Black women are dying at disproportionate rates in childbirth, and that is not okay. It's unacceptable. We know it's a problem, and we're going to figure out a solution to this. And I think all too often Black women are, when you look at our demographics, we're super educated, we're super hard workers. A lot of us are breadwinners for our households, but it's like, can we even have a baby and know that we're going to live? And it doesn't matter your socioeconomic, platform, because you say what part of the spectrum you're on, because you see someone like Serena Williams who had issues during childbirth because, her medical team was just not listening to her needs. You go all the way down to, the average person in my district in, South Memphis. That's something that has to change.
On that, I think about for Black women, this is something I feel like I've always kind of been aware of, that this is a concern, even if it wasn't necessarily talked about. I guess it's just kind of there percolating in the back of your mind. Is this something that needs to be talked about more, so that not just within Black and brown communities, but as a whole, so that our white counterparts are aware that this is something we're facing as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is an American issue. You know what I mean? This is something that everyone should be concerned about when you have, we're not talking about someone their pregnancy experience may have been more painful. We're talking about the difference between life and death. And so, yes, and I think that even needs to go a step further because it needs to be institutionalized within our medical schools, our teaching, and our residency programs. I mean, we have dealt with the same thing with sickle cell, where you have Black people who have sickle cell who will go to the emergency room and will be discriminated against, won't be given the pain meds that they need when they might be in crisis, where they're wearing their, Harvard sweatshirts or their suits so that they can get the type of respect they need. So this definitely needs to translate into a language that is universally understood in the medical profession and in, the white community, that Black women, when they say they're in pain in childbirth or something's not right, they need to be listened to because that is the difference between life and death for them.
When we look at pregnant women who are incarcerated, how do we begin to change the narrative that they somehow deserve less healthcare because they're incarcerated, because they somehow did something to deserve the position that they're in?
I think, to your point, they're being dehumanized, and so I think we have to continue to push the narrative of a shared humanity. Would you want your sister? Would you want your mother? Would you want your wife to have this experience? Would you want, when you say this innocent unborn child, would you want them to have that experience? At the end of the day, hopefully that's enough. I mean, the way that things have kind of continued to shake out, this is 2024, and I've been surprised and disappointed by how cruel people can be towards each other. But I think that narrative has to kind of be as pervasive as possible. And that all parts of incarceration, when you look at the fact that most of the people who are incarcerated will join the regular citizen population, every aspect of that, every aspect of rehabilitation, and who are you creating that's going to exit the system. So for me, it's in that basic shared humanity and just not letting people forget that.
We have had several advocates tell us, as we've been recording for this episode, that what they would like to see is pregnant women no longer incarcerated, other programs available for them, either until they have had their pregnancy or at least through, I think, even up to 12 months after pregnancy, so that they can have the pregnancy, have the birth, have time to bond with that child, breastfeed before serving whatever sentence it is that has been handed down. Is that something that you see as feasible or worthwhile for our elected leaders to investigate a little bit more?
I think it's complicated, but it is definitely something that needs to be investigated, right? Because at the end of the day, you want the mother to survive, you want the child to survive, and not just survive, but thrive. And, you know, s- science has already told us the importance of the woman and the child receiving care while the neonatal care receiving the postpartum care and also being able to bond and grow, the benefits of being able to be around your parent and the significant consequences. And I'm talking about, whether we're talking about the adverse childhood experiences that lead to poor health outcomes, more criminal behavior, less productive work days. So I say, from a bleeding heart liberal, this is the right thing to do. I think that there can also be a financial justification for it. And it certainly is something that should be studied. Obviously, if you have someone that is such a significant danger to themselves or to others, there may be some sort of situation where you have some sort of institutionalized situation. But I still think it can be done in a way that is protective and needed for the mom and the child, for sure. Not just in some random jail cell. Like, we had a woman in Nashville who was left alone in a jail cell to give birth. And that is not, and this just happened. And this is after our bill passed. I mean, it became law. Well, it became law. Yeah, it already become law. So it's just, that's what we have to avoid, right? So certainly I think it's worth studying and really seeing the long-term impacts it can have. It's one of those things that, a little bit of prevention and spending in the beginning, and it's going to have a tremendous outcome in the end.
The horror stories that you hear, because that this is not the first time that we have had one of our guests for this episode mention what incarcerated women go through when they are pregnant. We just spoke with Pamela Wynn, who shared her story with us about being shackled and losing her baby. And so knowing how pervasive it is, and that this is not, an isolated event for just one woman or just one state, I think it's very heartbreaking to know that this is happening, and as we said, very dehumanizing. And so I do want to be conscious of your time, Senator. And so just one more quick question. As we're still figuring out on many different levels how we provide for incarcerated pregnant people, and get them the health they deserve and need, what words of encouragement or enlightenment would you want to share with these women as they're waiting to find out what's going to happen to them, what's going to happen to their babies?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. It is such a terrible situation. It is heartbreaking. It is dehumanizing. It crushes your spirit. It crushes your hope. But I will say that there are people who are fighting for you, and you are fighting for yourselves. Every group, every bill that I've worked on like this has had a tremendous team of advocates who have either been directly impacted or who understand the significance and importance of making sure that we get this right. I think times are changing when you have the vice president of the United States, who she herself as a Black woman is speaking about the consequences of not doing the right thing, not getting this right on Black maternal health. So just know times are changing, and you have people who are there in the highest levels of government to the lowest levels of government that are trying to support and change this so that future generations will not have to deal with this very unfortunate and downright foolish reality. I mean, at the end of the day, everyone says America, is the best country in the world. We have all these XYZs, all these innovations, and you still have women dying in childbirth at crazy rates in one of the most developed countries, if not the most developed, depending on who you talk to, country in the world. So just know that times are changing, and we're aware of it, and we're working on it, and just hold strong, and you matter. Your baby matters. And there's so much more love for you than you think.
Senator, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.